Today is Monday, February 17th, 2025. My name is Abigail Russell. I am interviewing James Aldrete in Austin, Texas for the Voces Oral History Center. We are at the University of Texas at Austin campus. Thank you, Mr. Aldrete, for agreeing to this interview. Just a couple of notes at the top. The raw, unedited recording of this interview will be archived at the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection on the University of Texas campus, where it will be available to anyone who wishes to access it. If there's anything you don't wish to talk about, we respect your wishes. Also, if there is something you want to discuss, please do make sure we discuss it. Please also let us know if you need to pause the interview. Today, we are going to talk about your life experiences. As part of this, we'll also discuss your father, your time at UT, and your work as a political consultant. And if you're ready, Mr. Aldrete, let's begin with your childhood. Your father, Chris Aldrete, was a well-respected civil rights attorney. Can you tell me a bit about him and his path?
Sure. He was one of 11 kids out of Del Rio, and so was part of that kind of GI generation during World War II. So he signed up to serve, but beforehand, I'd say real quick that he was the bookish kid. He was aware of things. He understood the segregation that was going on in his high school. But understood also, the civil rights movement that was happening with the African American side, even though this was still like 30s and 40s. He was a member of the ACLU in his high school days. But then it was service that first took him to, I think, Colorado. He learned Japanese. The majority of his being stationed was in different parts of India where they do just kind of radio transmissions and translations. But it was still an incredible experience where, a kid from a segregated town that was basically just, Anglo and Hispanic with very little integration, got to, work alongside, cook alongside, serve alongside people from all over the country. And that kind of interchange, I think, shaped his perspective going on. He came back, like I said, he was a bookish kid, so the GI Bill was what allowed him to go to college and be part of that first generation. It was first him, he was number 7, but encouraged his younger brother George to do it as well. Came to UT. At UT at the time, I believe there were only 2 Hispanic professors in the faculty out of the entire. So one would be Carlos Castañeda, that, the graduate library is in part named after. And then the other was Georgie Sanchez, yeah. The education building is now named after. But Dr. Sanchez was really the mentor for this group. They lived in kind of a co-op. It was mainly an Hispanic co-op that they combined themselves. They had, civic groups like the Alba Club, and it was really to try to get Hispanics, more integrated. But it was still UT in those late 40s and early 50s.
And what is the American GI Forum?
Yeah, so he became an early lieutenant to Dr. Hector B. Garcia. And Dr. Garcia in Corpus Christi, to have Hispanics in South Texas kind of move up in the professional ranks and then provide professional services to a community that didn't really receive it. So he was very much a community doctor. The real spark was that there was another GI, Felix Longoria, came out of Three Rivers, Texas, small little South Texas town, private, serving on I believe in the Philippines area, died in service, and his small town would not provide funeral services in the one funeral home of Three Rivers, Texas. So they really made that a rallying cry. Dad was one of a number of lieutenants with Dr. Garcia. At the time, the Senate Majority Leader was then Lyndon B. Johnson. And so to have the Texas Senate Majority Leader step in and intervene, Felix Longoria is now buried in Arlington Cemetery with military heroes instead of in his hometown of Three Rivers, Texas. But then the GI Forum also took on a lot of school segregation or integration cases, and really used Brown versus Board of Education to go sue West Texas school districts mainly that would separate kids, saying they had English deficiencies, although they never tested them. And again, Dr. Sanchez was that mentor and also provided a lot of the research just showing that there are no, despite these stereotypes, academic or intellectual deficiencies among Hispanics. Just one of those opportunities to learn they can, compete and achieve. And then the other part of it is, with integration, everyone's English gets better.
What was your understanding of your father when you were growing up?
My understanding of him? So I'm the youngest of five. I was born in Austin. All my siblings were born in Del Rio. But I claim just to have lived here for my formative 4 months before we moved up to the D.C. area. Other Texas friends that were born up in D.C. had to have bags of dirt sent over so they could put underneath their bed and then say they were born over Texas soil. But I was actually born here. And his first jobs were political. So he moved up to D.C. to work at the Democratic National Committee, really as the Mexican-American liaison for what was supposed to be the LBJ re-election, eventually became the Humphrey campaign. But he had a regional appointment here, which I guess went a little bit on the last end of Kennedy and the first part of the Johnson administration. But when you grow up in D.C., you're kind of surrounded by politics. And then over the years as a kid, and then, even through high school stuff, the amount of politicals from throughout the Southwest, Hispanics that as they come to D.C. for some reason, it seemed like they ended up at our dinner table. And so, those conversations about politics, about the GI Forum, about the civil rights stuff, about the Voting Rights Act, we were a Voting Rights Act family. That was probably the most critical thing to my dad as far as that accomplishment from the LBJ administration to provide that. And then when the Voting Rights Act got extended to Hispanics and extended to Texas in the 70s, it still kind of helped push this larger political community that he was with. Anyway, so surrounded by it, and I got the bug early.
How did your understandings change over time?
When you kind of go back through, and I have, so he had also served on the city council and then ran for county attorney. And then you also heard some of the fights before I was born. And that was within the Democratic Party. They'd go and kind of have I guess they call it the rump convention, but because there were many things, even in the Democratic establishment, that would just kind of exclude Hispanics. He was much more of a rabble-rouser as an outsider, and then you saw him kind of work in as an insider, and some of that portions adapt. So when you look at some of his old campaign, he printed newsletters. One of his first jobs was just working as a letterpress guy at the local Spanish newspaper. The language was much more bold and rebellious. And then moving on, the language became much more inclusive and policy-oriented.
Why did you feel it was important to have his papers deposited at the Benson Latin American Collection?
I think that was probably his desire as well, even though things happen and, whenever it's organized is when the time comes. I will say that in his time at UT, just because a long little side story, but I'll come back to it. But his time at UT, he could get enough credits and then go on to law school. So he never graduated. He never graduated with his bachelor's. His degree was having a JD. So he had enough credits from UT and then moved to Houston to study at the South Texas College of Law. His career moved on. Eventually I think the peak of it was he was a Carter appointee. During that administration, the Reagan era came in, worked on the Hill towards retirement, and then they moved back to Texas about a couple years after I did. And then for his ego, he wanted to get that UT degree and finish up. But he had to, argue with the bursar's office on the tuition stuff that he should have as a veteran. Then he also had to learn that he couldn't graduate on the 1948 catalog. He had to graduate on the 1986 catalog and go back and learn science and stuff. But he took classes with, Professor Jamel on U.S. border Mexican politics. And they would just kind of go back and forth. My friends would be in those classes. We took a class together. And with Charles Ramirez Berg in Hispanic stereotypes in film and TV. But that part of border politics, especially the American GI Forum, civil stuff, it was Dr. Jamel's wife was at the Benson Latin American Library and also kind of encouraged us to make sure that we grabbed the papers that we could find and get organized and deposit them. But why it's important, let me just add too. I mean, what I appreciate about Voces is these stories aren't told. That there's a large part of history, even when I came to UT, and I found professors I connected with. One was Rolando Hinojosa Smith, and there was a whole generation of kind of Mexican-American writers that wanted to give a different side than, the statue that's down there by Barton Springs of Frank Dobie and Webb and others that kind of would mythologize kind of an Anglo-Texas history, and the other part of it isn't written. So the fact that there is that collection, and we do support researchers to make sure that the whole breadth of the story is told, is definitely important.
Who had kept those records, and how did you and your brother get them transferred?
Dad kept the records, just old filing cabinets, old a garage full of stuff. And it was I give my brother Eddie credit for really helping getting that organized.
How much did you know about the lawsuit in Del Rio that your grandfather was involved in?
Not enough, and I still need to go back on that. I do remember, so I did grow up 4 months old through graduation of high school on the East Coast, and I say it as a joke, but it's fairly true. Friends would go to Disneyland. We'd pack 5 kids in a car and drive 2,000 miles to go to Borderland. Would always go to Brownsville to see my mom's sisters, but every other trip we would definitely go through Del Rio as well. And as we're leaving either my aunt's house, one of his older sisters, and then we're passing by, and he just sees an older woman on a swing in her front yard. He makes sure that we stop, we go greet, and everyone meets. But like when he helped on that second level, because the one that my grandparents were involved in as plaintiffs, either it took a while or it took a second case before that happened. But it still required the courage of parents to go register their Hispanic kids into what was the previously only Anglo school and walk in with the courage, their head up. And it was this woman that we stopped by to visit. No power, no position, no title, just a mom who helped lead other parents and give them the courage to make sure that they had the best education for their kids. So that was just a memorable stop.
Did you grow up surrounded by key Mexican-American civil rights figures?
Key, it depends. There's definitely just a lot of players. So I grew up in a predominantly Anglo community in Virginia. We lived in the suburbs of DC when he worked there. Because it was DC, it was a very transient kind of community. So you just had, you'd have senators' kids go to school. You'd have diplomats and others, different families. Not everyone was really, very few people were actually from there. But it was the dinner table that would, Fabian Chavez was, a state rep and a state senator out of New Mexico. Folks from California that would come through, a lot from San Antonio. I just say there are a lot of fighters in the cause. A lot of soldiers in the movement more than key figures.
What was your childhood like growing up in DC?
Um, Pretty generic, to be honest. Um, Now it's strange. It wasn't really then to have a large family or to have, five siblings. I think we might have been on the upper end of the average, but, it was still a suburban house. Um, you rode bikes, a lot of family stuff, a lot of, it was important to my mom that we went to mass regularly. It just felt a very neighborhood, feeling. But I'd say the contrast from those summer vacations going home, um, you just realize what a different environment it was from what they grew up in, and much more of a larger family extended connectedness, much more of a sense of place. I mean, you can think of DC and there's the monuments, but you really go into a community that has a sense of place. I'd say both Del Rio and Brownsville did and do. And you got that sense of a shared history. In the DC area, I don't think you have a sense of shared history, but it was fun and the opportunities were there. And I think they were proud to give us what they believed was a strong education.
Who were your best friends?
Nasser Gaimi was one for the longest time, and his family was just, refugees from the Shah from Iran. And so we were also friends before and during, the hostage crisis. And so just anger towards him or misunderstanding towards him, we got chased a bunch. He was chased. I would just run with him. Peter Chaporis, just a friend from elementary school through high school. We just go fishing together. There's a number of them.
What languages were spoken in your home?
I think I represent a generational attitude of a slight resentment that Spanish wasn't easily passed on to us. I've reclaimed it fairly well, but it wasn't, it was their language between our parents, but they had that idea, as many parents of their time did, that they want to make sure that children knew English, that no one questioned the quality of their English, that they didn't speak with an accent or anything that might have opened them up to any discrimination. But then their parties, the jokes were in Spanish. The musics were in Spanish. The chisme was in Spanish. So then you feel like you're keeping up with the majority of it, and then you're like left out at this next part. And then obviously going back to Texas, grandmother on my dad's side was fairly good at English. Grandmother on my mother's side knew like 20 words. So again, that history of the family stuff went back into Spanish, and so that was a big inspiration to reclaim the language.
What about your neighborhood? What languages were spoken?
Mainly English. When families would visit, grandparents, Peter's grandparents, grandfather would speak, Greek, and that was my dad's passion to learn Greek. He learned Japanese in the war. There's Vietnamese and Korean families that, settled in that area as well, again, mainly on diplomatic and short-term tours. But bilingualism or multilingualism wasn't really pushed at the time.
What was it like when you visited Del Rio?
You realize what a privileged kid I was, because the chance to go was summer vacation when kids are out of school. So you're coming back to Texas in August. You'd see the T-shirts in the little shop, in the little breakfast shops, and Del Rio's slogan, I think, was 2 miles from the border, 2 feet from hell. And in August, it's pretty hot. And then my grandmother's house, which was the central point, was in the Barrio de Chihuahua, and so they, you'd have the window units, but you didn't have central AC in the way that we grew up with. and you see a small older house, and you're like, all right, 11 kids. How did this work? Because it's really just a 3-room at most, kind of adobe house. But the joy that just happened in that house, the reunions that happen in that house, that it just, you forget about those surroundings. And I'd say that there's that immediate sense of place. I'd also say, it's the experience my cousins have. It's experience my wife has. It's you're in Del Rio, but a large portion of it will then be celebrations across, or the same thing for Brownsville on my mom's side. A large portion of it will be celebrations across. So the dinners in Acuña or the dinners in Matamoros, and then even though they're just a mile and a half from each other, really, on either grandparents' house to be across, they were so at ease, but the culture and the feel was so very different.
What did it mean to you and your siblings to get to go?
Let's see, my dad passed in 91. I got married in 2005. And so even 14 years after he passed, all 8 of his surviving siblings came to the wedding. That there is just, all 5 siblings are still incredibly tight. There is, what my dad made the trips happen, but my mom drilled it in, is what family means. And so, again, knowing a bit where you come from, knowing the extended part of it, it's a little tough to keep up with, because on my dad's side, I probably have a little over 40 first cousins. And on my mom's side, there's probably like 30 first cousins. But you can meet, and it's like as no time has passed. And that there is a shared history, no matter how different we are now or different our lives, paths have taken us on. There's there. I'd also say that 2 of my sisters, were lifetime teachers, and there's like a sense of service and a sense of community that I think comes from those trips that we made.
What kind of activities did you guys do when you were there?
Eventually, they humor us a little bit. So especially when we go down to Brownsville, we'd get a day or 2 on the island to go to South Padre, but it'd also go to Matamoros, which is, fun. Their places, like, was the drive-in for a kid like me and my brother, the younger 2 of the 5. It was, the exotic bird cages. It was the jazz band. It was just the different service. It was eating frog legs. It was going through the markets. It was just, a different experience than any of our friends had in Virginia. But for the hours that we'd be at our grandmother's house in Brownsville, we'd be bored silly. And, you still had the furniture the nice furniture covered in plastic, and the cheap furniture where everyone kind of gather. So my grandmother on my mom's side was really just a block from the cemetery. And then, over the course of it, so my brother and I would just kind of go explore. And over the course of it, those images stuck with me. I think it was a Texas book festival, and I pick up a book on the Cortina Wars and Juan Nepomuceno Cortina, and you see those same headstones that we just go play and hide around, were from an historic moment of ethnic divides in the valley. We just had no idea the history we were playing around. On my dad's side, we'd also go visit my aunt. It wasn't that far, but it was the 2 barrios, the barrio de Chihuahua, the barrio de San Felipe. And, you went into San Felipe was really where the majority of the Hispanics were, other than the little barrio de Chihuahua. But similar, it was cemetery visits were a constant. And you just see the history that's in there. It's pretty amazing. But you also get, railroad tracks and how things are a little bit segregated. You get where the old schools or the Mexican schools were and where the Anglo schools were. And then you also get not a sense of the rebelliousness that I'd see in my dad's rhetoric, but a sense of appreciation and relationships that weren't necessarily there beforehand.
What was your family like?
Crazy, fun, all very different, but again, enjoy spending time together. So it's like there's like 3 older siblings and 2 younger siblings, but we're still incredibly united, but we can still fight, at a moment's notice.
How did your parents feel about the role of education?
That was huge. And again, just to talk on my mom for a second, she was the youngest of 11. And it was one of her older brothers, because of service in World War II and the GI Bill, was able to go to college. She was able to go because she was the youngest. And it started off at Texas Southmost, and then there was a comfort level that she could go to Incarnate Word, being a safe school, even though it was, 200 miles away. But being a Catholic school and the knowing other families that were there. But she had to start off at Texas Southmost and go there. So they were both part of the first generations in their families to go to college. And then they were really both part of the first families to first generation to get out of their local area and see a bigger world. In that sense that education was the ticket, education was critical, was driven in all of us. And I think, currently right now, making sure that those efforts are there for first gen kids, I think is a passion to both my wife and myself. The benefits you have, and the stats of if you grew up in a family where the parents went to college, your chances of going to college are so much dramatically higher. And so progress is not always in a linear direction. And right now, making sure that those educational opportunities are there and people understand that that's got to be there for families that didn't have that opportunity, and that gets leveled out of it is critical to us. And I'd credit mom and dad on that, definitely.
What role did education play in your life?
Huge. I mean, I went to a suburban high school in the DC area that was, highly rated, surrounded by, kids smarter than me. I came back to UT as an in-state resident because my dad voted absentee and had his little place in Del Rio. And it was culture shock for me for a bit. And, thinking at the time it was still a lot of more hippies than I had in Virginia, more rural, families than I was encountered to in Virginia. And then it took me about a month to realize, and they're all smarter than me, and I had to pick up my own pace if I was going to compete and stay on track at UT. But it is education, and for my love-hate isn't necessarily the right word, but appreciation and frustrations with this university. My frustrations don't cloud the appreciation. That it still exposes you to worlds that you would have not the opportunity to do. I mean, so the Plan 2 program that I went to at UT brought larger thinking than, on one hand, this is being incoherent. Let me try this again. On one hand, they were proud to have us grow up in the DC area, to be exposed to it, to see kind of the history, being around the Capitol, being around political stuff became familiar. Being around, the Smithsonian's and the museums became familiar. On the other hand, it was still a first generation, heavily Catholic family that says, don't cause trouble, and do well in your studies, as opposed to, explore the world. And, Dad did because of service. And for the rest of us, it was really college is what opens up those opportunities. Your real first philosophy class, your real first, broader into languages and broader into, frankly, meeting people different than you. There's a frustration now when you hear this kind of political line that's saying college isn't meant for everybody. But I know from my parents' history and listening at that table how many kids were discouraged from college. And there's nothing about the way Texas invests in public education that suggests that they believe college is for everybody. How do you keep that door open? Because those are where the civic questions are really brought up. You're exposed to, you get engaged into, and a lot of the challenges we have, we need more education, period.
What do you think your parents' expectations were of you?
I'd say it was probably never heavily stated other than the expectation that you're going to go to college. And then, even though they appreciated college and the expectation, that you'll get a job. So those two things were a bit there. And then they definitely wanted to see you, follow a passion and stay involved. I will say, as you get older, you learn where your parents' perspective comes from as well. And they were both Depression-era kids. Dad born in 24, Mom born in 31. But Dad the 7th of 11, Mom the 11th of 11. On my mom's side, my grandfather passed fairly early. On my dad's side, he passed before he came back from service. And you really have these family operations where siblings help each other out and help support the larger family. So part of their advice was always have something to fall back on, as opposed to, blaze a trail. It was a bit of a sense of security and stabilization because they knew, those challenges, I think, from their families and the economic times of their day.
Can you tell me a story about those expectations?
Let me think on that.
We can come back to it.
I'll come back to that. I won't forget it.
What do you remember about your classroom experiences?
At UT or where?
Like in elementary, middle, or high school?
I mean, I remember one in high school, and it was a great program that was called Rural Civilization. And it really is, now my kid goes here to Austin-based high school, and all those kind of things are pushed into AP classes. But this was a version of an AP class but it didn't study for the tests. It really pushed a lot of that history discussion and diving in and what are the deeper questions to it. But there was a time that that they did a genealogy thing, and they so they believed in kind of open classrooms. So there might have been 60 of us, with multiple teachers, but it was still a larger kind of group. And then split us up in kind of ethnic, groups, and you're waiting to hear like anything Hispanic called. And then it's not. So then you realize, Italians and Irish and German kind of get these large groupings. And then you're like, all right, so even though you don't realize those differences, that kind of became clear. Had great teachers, and I can name a number of them that I think were just incredible influences. And even coming from a household that believed in education and a household of college educated parents, I'd say going back through my experiences is another part of fighting for education and how we treat teachers as well.
Did being Latino impact the way other students treated you?
No. I mean, I think more people wanted to come by my house for the food. Definitely. Um, I think I do also remember in one of those parts of it, either I've just picked it up from my siblings, you know, and mispronouncing our name, and we just, made it easy for other people. So, and then my brother had it worse because if you say Aldrete and then Eddie Aldrete, it just kind of like rhymed and made it easy for people. But I do remember a presentation where you had to do an oral presentation, like James Aldrete, and just the fact that you said it differently for that one time, but then it was just a conscious decision to say it differently from then on. I'd say it was an educated area, and a lot of people that necessarily weren't from there, and so they traveled a bit, and I think they appreciated what there was of diversity, at least either in geographic or in employment, or there were really, if I was one of 3 Hispanic kids in this class of 500, there might have been only 3 African American, but diplomat families probably made up 50, whereas we made up 6. But no, I think I'd never faced any obstacle really.
Were there many other Latino students at your school?
They probably thought so, but he was Filipino, so he just had an Hispanic sounding surname. I think there was one or two Puerto Rican kids, but no one else from the Southwest.
What kind of materials do you remember?
Materials?
Like from school?
I don't know. We'll come back to that one as well.
What shaped you growing up?
I think for those that know me, it's pretty obvious. My dad to me was a giant. So hearing both, you get a chance to kind of walk into the households of where they grew up, a sense of what it took. You also have the Hollywood part of mythology on World War II. Some of it's mythology, but some of it's just real service. He wasn't in necessarily a combat zone, but, went wherever he's told. Learned Japanese, traveled through India. But then he also had a sense of humor and could just hold court. And that was just fascinating to watch. And because of his service part of it, and really, frankly, that fight for integration in West Texas school districts and beyond, that sense of why the Voting Rights Act was so important in our household, was that sense of kind of inclusion, and there's something that we all gain from each other. I'll go back to, I think it was 8th grade, that we were encouraged to have our parents come, speak on career stuff, and I just obligatory passed that along, and he jumped at it, and then that frightened the heck out of me. I didn't want my dad coming to school and talking to my class, and within seconds, he had the meeting out of his hands. But his message, even to them, was just making sure, you don't get his message to us into the class was like, don't be clannish, don't get cliquish. You always want to expand and meet different groups and kind of build those bridges. And frankly, there was plenty of Hispanics that would come through from Del Rio. But then there were also, every trip to Del Rio, we'd stop by the Stools, who had, the Jewish family in town that had, the fabric store, the Worleys, and these were all people that were fundamental in getting, a library to Del Rio, and that sense of, they read the New York Times, which no one else did in Del Rio. It was just like the sense of ideas and interchange that they could have. And Dad would be at events, it was him, it was like a lot of congressional old Texas leaders, Jim Wright, but there was also like John Henry Falk, who's an Austin hero. He was, comedian, singer, entertainer that was, blacklisted. Green Pastures, in South Austin is kind of his old family home. But just telling telling stories across cultures was something he was able to do. The period of that I grew up in, you almost wish that there were the fights of his day. There were the nuances were different. How you make a difference is different. But what shaped me was both hearing those stories, seeing the constant engagement, never seeing a bitterness, and then seeing both the power of a movement and the power just of human connection too through a joke and a story.
How much did you learn about the Mexican American experience in the U.S. and in Texas when you were a child?
So I'm the youngest of five, to a dad who was probably 41 when I was born. And so his generation on the kind of Mexican American civil rights, I think mirrored a bit of, the NAACP and stuff, on the African American part of it. They were the legal crew. The GI Forum was Dr. Garcia, and then in the lieutenants was Eridad, a lawyer, was, Jimmy Deanda, who became a judge, my dad. They were also part of the Hernandez case. But what got skipped over between my, growing up and their generation was really that whole Chicano era too. Which I think there were many of his generation that didn't embrace their tactics and their language immediately. And so that part of it, meant that I had to go and learn that history on my own and explore, which was UT for me, was explore, that literature, explore the stories and learn from many of the people that were in that movement. But some of those things was just remembering the jokes, because the jokes also told the stories. It's how farm workers leave border communities and then go further on, and you get a sense of both the broader movement, but then there were individual things. I mean, we walked through the cemetery without knowing the Cortina Wars. We'd go to Del Rio and we meet the mother who helped integrate, but didn't always get the larger story. So that's been an individual mission of mine to kind of fill in those gaps.
Your grandfather was a plaintiff in the Salvatierra. Sorry if I mispronounced that.
You're perfect.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I will have to dig with the siblings and I'll come back to you. I mean, basically, my grandfather was born in Villa Acuña before it was Ciudad Acuña. Had a little meat market neighborhood store. When I look at my dad's campaign newsletter, you'll see little advertisements, and they're basically 4 or 5, the Figueroas, the Escamillas, they all had little neighborhood stores. But then, people would still buy stuff on credit, and too much credit, they'd shut down. He'd be a cook down at the railroad station or down at the hotel and fill in. And everyone kind of had to do their part. So for the 3rd grade education and being a plaintiff, I don't know. I mean, I never met my grandfather. He passed in the 40s. And I'm born 20 years later. But you just have to have the sense of, they always present themselves with pride and with respect for themselves, but would then do anything for their neighbors. And the Guadalupe Society that my grandmother was part of with the church was still always just helping out other neighbors. I think the sense of having credit at your store as opposed to just demanding cash was helping out neighbors. But I don't know enough of that story. I mean, that was a landmark case, and you don't have a case without a plaintiff, and a 3rd grade education, but he had kids that deserved a better education. So it's a heroic thing.
Growing up, what was your understanding of politics?
It was a force for good. watch the news with my dad, constantly. At one point, he was the regional administrator for the Office of Economic Opportunity here in Austin, which is what brought us from Del Rio to Austin before going up to D.C. to work on what was supposed to be LBJ's reelection. Young person in his office. I'm not sure if he was a lawyer or not, but it was Bruce Babbitt, who eventually became governor of Arizona. And then, but we'd also watch when the news, and I must have been in high school, but when Mark White lost the election, I think it was actually lost the primary to John Hill, he felt it was very much, connected to not fighting and defending on the Voting Rights Act, because every time you have the Voting Rights Act, there's still Southern backlash to that part of it. And where Hispanics and other groups came in on that primary against Mark White and John Hill, I believe. I'll have to go double check that. But the Voting Rights Act was, again, instrumental. I have in my office framed just ad that he helped create when he was in Del Rio, and this was when it was under the GI Forum, and it was in Spanish, but just encouraging people to pay the poll tax. And they had their Spanish chants about, pay the poll tax, voting, it's what, it advances la raza. But politics was a force for good, always.
Was there a specific instance from your childhood that made you want to go into politics?
I'd say I'd ask questions at the dinner table, especially as there were guests there. Knowing the story of Felix Longoria and Three Rivers, I would hear his stories about integrating school districts and the lawsuits that he would do with West Texas, and he would still tell it off as a joke, but he faced threats, and he would, the county judge or the sheriff would just say, Mr. Aldrete, just want to let you know that we've had threats against your life, and for your own personal safety, you may not want to stay here long. So, he would just joke it off in his storytelling and saying, thank you very much, but, my religion teaches me that death is inevitable, and, it will come when it comes. But then he'd say, but what I didn't tell him is he had his little revolver next to the Bible in case he needed some backup. And we just kind of brush some of that stuff off. But that sense that all civil rights stuff, especially seeing that there were Hispanics that were standing on the shoulders and doing equal work as the African American civil rights movements of the 60s, was definitely fundamental. And frankly, it's his earlier career more than his later career that's always fascinated me.
Why did you decide to go to UT Austin?
Again, I'll just go to growing up in the DC suburbs. So much of our community wasn't from there, and the fact that we were a Texas household was clear. That's where our vacations were. We rooted for the Cowboys. The food we had for dinner was just different, which is why friends wanted to hang out at our house. The trips that we would make, but we also rooted for the Longhorns. My dad went to UT, and although not an official grad, that was part of that identity. But then, like I said, I got the political bug fairly early, and the sense that Texas is where we're from and where the home is. That this is the place that builds leaders.
What were your college years like?
Fun. Just I think similarly met people that had shared passions, even if they came from very different walks of life. you know, me and a friend ran for student government. He should have ran at the top, but he ran for vice president. He won. I made the runoff and came close. Got involved in the Texas student lobby, and so we went and took on tuition increases at the legislature. We, fought to get student representation on the Board of Regents. Did our best to shine a light about whether the university population is reflective of the state that it's supposed to represent. UT has always prided itself as being a research university, but we felt it needed to be reminded it also has an undergraduate obligation. And so much of the effort has always been on the research side of stuff. But that was also at a time when the state provided a significant share of the funding. And so that part of it is dwindled down. Philanthropy, research grants do much more of a share of keeping this university going than it did. But I think that need to remind people that it's still the state institution and should be serving the broad Texas population. But yeah, my activities, I started off, I could get into UT at the time with like a late application, and the application was 1 page, and then I got, because nothing was online at the time, I got, that in, then I realized that there was a 10-month waiting for housing. So I eventually landed in a co-op in West Campus. And my dad had been in a co-op, but, that was the 40s and this was now the 80s, and it was just a very different thing. But it introduced me to all the diversity of this area, but eventually moved into kind of UT housing, made a whole different group of friends. But then it was probably the activism more than anything else that I have some lifelong friends.
Were you involved in any Latino or Mexican American organizations?
A lot of good friends there were. Tomas Aldrete, Rene Lara, Gato Falan. But the activities I was on was mainly Texas Student Lobby, and then supporting other friends in student government, and then making sure that, again, it was a lot of the political part of keeping tuition low. Is there a student voice, in the decision making, and then holding accountability on recruitment and retention, and ensuring that the student body population reflects the face of Texas.
What major did you start with, and what were your initial career ambitions?
Politics, I think, was always the goal, and it might have been at one point more running for office than it turned out to be. So I started in the liberal arts program in government here as a freshman, but I went to an out-of-state high school. I wasn't aware of the Plan 2 program. I was able to get in the Plan 2 program my second semester. The government courses, frankly, became less interesting because a lot of the political science at the time, the research, was all model-based and didn't delve into history, didn't delve into movements of modern campaigns. So the exposure I was able to get, because it was a more flexible program, introduced me into communication school. Kathleen Hall Jameson had like an introduction to campaign rhetoric, and I just, fell in love on that aspect of it. And then maybe the different version of your own story of like a journalism and that idea of law school. I was thinking law school was the path into politics. And then I realized that there was a path that was much more flexible and much more where I had enjoyment. I wanted to make ads. I wanted to shape the way people talk about politics. I wanted, you could throw punches and political communication in a way you can't in a policy aspect if you're inside the Capitol on that part of it. And it probably goes back to the two parts of my dad's career, when he was a rebel and when he was an insider. And that sense of like, how do you shake up the establishment to create the kind of changes you want to see versus how do you like incrementally do it or what I've seen in a lot of my experiences, when you hit a wall, when there's an outside movement that we're not able to compete with, that progress isn't always continual. That you'll see those backlash movements, and those backlash movements can gain popularity or can settle in or can stop things or can move the clock backwards. And what I knew from my dad's part of it was how much the courts were critical in creating the changes that they saw. And then there was a period between his age and mine where you saw the courts couldn't always be depended on, and we need to create a political environment that supports that level of change. So Dr. Jameson, Dr. J, opened me up to it. And then there was a chance, she said I should think about graduate school and the idea of getting it into speech communication and rhetoric, but with my focus really being on more political communication, was a path that was much more appealing than having to go learn real estate law, even if I didn't want to do real estate or contracts or other aspects to a law degree.
So did your major change at all in your undergraduate?
I stayed in the undergraduate. I was always in liberal arts, and then the moving from government, which might have been my placeholder, to plan two, and then, the joke was plan to what? Plan to graduate. You just had flexibility, but you also had small classes, core classes of kind of deeper writing, deeper thinking, and that also gave me some flexibility to take communication courses, but I graduated with a Plan 2 degree.
How did college help you navigate what you wanted your future career to be?
I'll go back to high school for 1 second, and I did take a political science class in my senior year, and it gave us all really a chance to then do an internship, and so we could leave school early, get our way to the metro, get into DC, and mine was an internship with the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee. So I got a chance to kind of feed that bug early a bit. I just did research in the Library of Congress and going through clips. So that aspect was kind of there. I might not have worked my first semester at UT, but then eventually had just a job as a runner, which is just doing errands, for Mark White did make it back into the governor's office, and he was running his reelection campaign. And so the runner would basically take an envelope of materials from the governor's office on the second floor, 4 blocks over to the campaign office. So they had what they needed, and then anything that needed to go back to Dwayne Holman, the chief of staff, I'd run that back over. But was working on the campaign part of it. So I had that internship with the DSCC. I had, a job with a campaign. It eventually lost to Bill Clements, but was still part of that. And then I had classes that introduced me into let's analyze political advertising and political speech. And I got hooked on that, and that opened up, graduate school. I joke, but it's true. It became a graduate degree because in the middle of it, I had then a chance to join the Ann Richards campaign for governor. They got, like many campaigns, they weren't watching their finances, but I was working on the press side, doing a lot of really kind of correspondence, thank you letters, following up with people. And then they let go of junior staff because they needed to get leaner, and moved into kind of just jobs with different consulting firms that end up supporting Governor Richards' campaign, and that was a winning one, so that was nice. But that idea to then help shape writing on direct mailers that helped coincided with what I was able to do with Dr. Jameson, and then even in the graduate school, doing a thesis on how negative messages were masked with positive feelings.
Were there any other professors or mentors that had a strong impact on you?
That's a great question, and it's something I like push onto my son. I mean, you go into UT, and um, I know you transferred. I'm just how you get to like actually get to know professors takes a little bit of luck, a little bit of chemistry, but then you got to start making that initiative. So the two that had the biggest impact on me would definitely be Kathleen Hall Jamison. As I got into a little bit of different courses in communications, John Daly and Rod Hart, I think, were also very big influences. In the liberal arts program, Rolando Hinojosa Smith introduced me to, like I said, a lot of those gap years between my dad's generation, a lot of the kind of Chicano writing, and small classes, and Rolando Hinojosa Smith, a gruff old guy, but it was a real appreciation.
What class did you and your father take together?
We took Hispanic stereotypes in film and TV. And it was a fairly young professor at the time, but it was Charles Ramirez-Berg. The dad was always going to be in the front row, in that sense of how people, he loved that class. But he hadn't written a paper in, 20 or so years. So I'd go stop by the house, typically around dinner time, just to get a free meal. And I was just like, hey, what are you writing your paper on? He goes, I haven't written it yet. I'm like, I know, but what are you thinking about? And he wouldn't do it just because of the nerves of having to write that again. I had to miss one class. I think it was when our papers got, turned back. And so I had to go knock on Dr. Ramirez-Berg's, office during office hours to see if I could pick up my paper. And he goes, oh, I gave it to your dad. I'm like, ugh. So I got a better grade on the first paper, but then that switched around by the end of the course.
What was it like taking a class together?
It was fun. Like I said, he could just, entertain. But it also coincided a little bit as my political bug, both on campus and in the legislature, probably took away a little bit from my academic excelling. And I might not have done that balance as well. It still overlapped with a lot of his part of it. I think the fun stuff was, that was only one class we did together. But it was really my friends that took U.S.-Mexico border history together with him and Dr. Jamail. They, would just say, like, they got cricks in their neck because they'd go back and forth between my dad and the professor who were friends. But again, it's supposed to be embarrassed. It was 8th grade all over again. He would just held court and blended in.
I know we touched on this a bit at the beginning, but what influenced your dad to go back to school?
I think it was really just the prestige of what a UT diploma means on your wall or in your closet or in your files. Just knowing that it's there. But again, he was the bookish kid that was always learning. And I think the challenge was, again, he could no longer go on a 1948 catalog, so he needed 12 hours of math and science. And so, as brilliant as he was, and he was, the joke that my siblings make me retell is, again, it's a joke, but it's truth. So he needed math and science, and so he looked at astronomy and said, all right, that seems interesting, not realizing from his day that what a weed out course is. And so it's a large auditorium, and an older student, he's sincere. He's going to go to the front row, so he walks all the way down. And he had his job at the Capitol, and so he has his hard briefcase, and so he just pulls the little table, over, pulls up the briefcase, and I could just hear it. There's the little lashes, cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha, opens it up, gets his legal pad, closes it, cha-cha-cha-cha-cha-cha, puts it down, ready to take notes. The TA comes out and says, if you don't know your algebra, you need to drop this course now. The briefcase came back, and the cha-cha-cha, and then I did the walk of shame. So when it's in his element, doing the history parts of it with Dr. Jamail, I think that he loved the class with Charles. Catching up either with professors, he still had to overcome that math and science. But then he had to live out the advice he always told us: is you have to go outside of your comfort zones, get out, push yourselves in other directions. And so then he was also taking up classes at ACC to catch up on algebra so he could get those other science courses.
And what was his undergraduate degree in?
My guess was government.
Walk me through your career.
Well, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Well, that's I'm thinking in the 40s it was government, so it would have been government in the 80s.
Walk me through your career. How did you become a political consultant?
So the internship, was an unpaid thing during high school, but it was also when my dad's old boss was the chair of the DSEC. So Lloyd Benson, the Texas U.S. Senator, was head of the DSEC, and his chief of staff was the head of the DSEC. That was just an opportunity to kind of get something on the resume. The chance to become. Then I had my freshman summer, I think, is when I had the internship with the state of Texas Office of State Federal Relations, and that was just a random application that went in and that came through. But every state pretty much has a representative office in D.C. to be that liaison on grants and federal funding that will go through agriculture or health and human services or transportation dollars. John Hanson was like a 29-year-old head of that office, and then he's the one that connected me with Dwayne Holman, the governor's chief of staff, and got me helped me get a job as just a runner on the Mark White campaign. The campaign was just down the hall from the state party office. Mark McKinnon, Jane Hedgepeth, Ed Martin. Ed Martin was the ED of the state party. Jane Hedgepeth was the finance director. Mark McKinnon was actually the press secretary for the governor's campaign. Dave Gold did different direct mail, both fundraising and other stuff for the campaign. And then it was through that network that they got me an internship with Gold Communications and Dave Gold's shop. That became eventually bought out or merged into a larger consulting firm called Public Strategies. And the connection to my dad's stuff, it was a lot of old Lloyd Benson people. And so there was a lot of people that at one point, worked with my dad as well on Senator Benson campaigns. And that was a great experience. I met a lot of fascinating people, and then got a chance to work on things that weren't just local, but that were both state and across the country. Their movement and that desire for the building of that firm was to use their political skills and kind of take it into the corporate world. And my desire, again, fascination on the early parts of my dad's career was on throwing bombs and rebelliousness and change. And so the corporate aspect of the company became less and less interesting. And planned to finish up my graduate degree and get that behind me, as Dad wanted to get his behind him. And I mean, the reality was I wasn't enjoying that work when it became all corporate. I didn't have any desire to leave Austin. I'm the son of two, federal government bureaucrats, eventually Depression-era kids. I'm not really entrepreneurial. I was just unemployable. And then the chance to work on my own was what was in front of me. And instead of being kind of the snarky copywriter in the back, I had to go do the sales aspect of it and expand my own political networks. And at the time, the state party was still kind of holding on to East Texas and some of their historic roots, and there wasn't anyone serving San Antonio and serving South Texas. And those doors just opened. And the chance to, bring some passion to how they develop their message and shape their message, we just got a lot of opportunities. The people you meet made it fun. It wasn't really necessarily a business plan. But yeah, we're close to 30 years into it.
Could you tell me a little bit about your company, message, audience, and presentation?
Sure. So you can tell a little bit by the title that I was in graduate school at the time. So message, audience, and presentation in my mind was just kind of an English variation of Aristotle's ethos, pathos, and logos. So it's just the connection of how communication works together, that you have to have that individual credibility, that you're shaping your message and you have an understanding of your audience. And so I didn't want really an ego firm with a family name on it. I wanted to have a sense of how we do things differently and what we're bringing to the table. So playing around with it, message, audience, and presentation just became MAP. No one other than me really knows what it stands for anymore because we just kind of go by MAP. But it was always about bringing a different level, a little bit of my own thoughts, a little bit of the thinking that I got exposed to at UT, definitely, that we could have stronger levels of communication. And then starting on my own, the doors were open in South Texas. One of the last campaigns I worked on with Public Strategies was Rolando Rios, a longtime voting rights attorney out of San Antonio. He challenged Henry Bonilla for congressional office. And then as I started my own company, 3 different opportunities kind of came up of open seats. Kika de la Garza, a longtime family friend, had retired. We got a chance to help on Ruben Hinojos's campaign and do his media. Ciro Rodriguez, it was Frank Tejeda passed away. And so Ciro Rodriguez, who I knew from Texas Student Lobby days, was a social worker in the state house, was running for Congress and up against a kind of a political machine. And we're able to be on that one and open. And all of these were like the Democratic primary at the time decided the race. So the Democratic primary really became the general election. So you didn't have outside DC consultants really competing for it. It became very local. And then the third, and this was all in kind of rapid succession, was another icon was Henry B. Gonzalez. When Henry B. Finally retired and his son Charlie Gonzalez decided to run for it, we had that opportunity to do the media. So we picked up 3 congressional races, kind of in rapid succession. And through that, we'd also been doing still a lot of work on the state house, and that was through relationships with the Texas Trial Lawyers Association, trial lawyers for a long time and still are a funding kind of foundation for a lot of Democratic campaigns. Through work with the Trial Lawyers Association, other consultants, it was just a referral that we got a chance to meet with and interview and become part of the Obama media team in 2008. But it started really with those 3 congressional races.
And what year did you start MAP?
I was unemployed in '95, and that was my fake employment, was to put up a company name. So 1995.
I'm glad you just brought this up. MAP worked for Obama's media team in 2008 and 2012. What was that like?
It was awesome. So the 2008 campaign especially, you go up to the original Chicago retreat with the media team. It was in David Axelrod's office. And then it was really him, and he chose kind of as a partner, not in his firm, but a partner on this endeavor was Jim Margolis. So you had David Axelrod and Jim Margolis, and then they had a team of different, consultants. And, what I learned more than anything was how you have a collaborative work environment. You have, people that, a structure that shared all the information that everyone needed to provide their best advice, but still had the decision-making aspect of how they did that part of it. And people could contribute to each other's work, but it wasn't turf conscious. No one had their name on any ad. It was always the Obama media team. It wasn't, even if one consultant took a lead. So it was a political operation that did its best to remove ego, get a sense of best practices, do collaboration. Politics are always going to have egos, even on the behind the scenes aspect of it. But the tone and the culture that they set was way different than anything I'd experienced in the past, and is what I've tried to kind of replicate. And then you also learn beyond political strategy, how you build a culture in a campaign, I think is probably equally as important.
How do you decide who to take as a client?
Early on, under Dr. Jameson, she would always bring in thought leaders and consultants as well and try to introduce me And one of the opportunities was with, a moderate Republican firm, but it didn't work out on their end or my end. You just realize that you're going to follow on what your passions are. And then also in the political space, I think it's true everywhere, but it's the divide on the political space is you're going to work where you're trusted. And so you're going to be trusted mainly by building on clients that have a continuity to it. And they all reflect my own personal beliefs. So we only work with Democrats. We have had the opportunity to do some bipartisan efforts, but we've never done like a Republican campaign. We've, within the past 2 years, did a project with Karl Rove, which, was on the opposite side of the Obama campaigns, and all on the Bush campaigns previously. But it was for Prop 5 and for higher education funding in a Republican state, but they needed a Democratic part of it to also help connect and bring representation in for University of Houston. I think there's still an argument about diversity within the Democratic sphere. And so one of the challenges, I think, among a lot of Hispanic candidates is, unlike my dad, they kind of build up out of local fiefdoms. And so that exposure to broader thoughts and exchange of ideas, I think we work with bigger thinkers. I think we work with more collaborators. We always work with Democrats. A lot of them have been Hispanic candidates, but then we've also helped bridge divides within, different communities. In 2010 or 14, I've lost track, I apologize, but we did a campaign for friend Javier Gonzalez to be mayor of Santa Fe. And Santa Fe has, on one hand, the bragging rights of Hispanic families that have been there 400 years. But it also brought in a lot of rich liberal Anglos from all over that built their community as well. So it's a progressive town, but still segregated socially. And helping Javier, who had that skill set, kind of build a bridge from old Hispanic into new progressive Anglos, and build that coalition, are the things that I think we enjoy doing.
Who are some of your current clients?
So in and off cycle, it's off cycle. We have few long time clients, but we're helping out Aaron Ford, who's the Attorney General in Nevada, running for governor in 2026. We do some ongoing work with the San Antonio mayor, with Ron Nirenberg, who will be termed out in June, likely May. But if it's a runoff to succeed him, he has to hold on till June, and helping him explore his next opportunities. Nothing's guaranteed. We've done the past 2 cycles with the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee on their independent expenditure. We do a lot of work in Nevada because there's a large Hispanic population. So we've worked with, from the Obama campaigns, it was then followed by Harry Reid's last reelection campaign in 2010. We did the first election for Catherine Cortez Masto and her reelect in 20. We did the first campaign for Senator Jackie Rosen, the junior senator to Catherine, in 2018, and then did her reelect in 24. So Nevada has become a place that we have a good foothold in. In Arizona, we've worked on, it's basically the super PAC or the IE that's related to the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, but it's called the Senate Majority PAC, where we've done the Senate races. You don't work directly with the campaign itself, but you augment their communication, and often you spend as much money, if not more money, on that. But we've done it for Ruben Gallego, for Mark Kelly, for Kirsten Sinema, on the past 5. But as we go into 2026, it'll be the first time we don't have a Senate race in Arizona and Nevada. But there will be one in Texas, so we'll see how that plays out.
Can you tell us more about creating effective messages for political candidates?
Yeah, I think we did an exercise with the team where we went back and really reviewed George Orwell essays. We went back and did Politics in the English Language and his other one on Why I Write. Part of it was just a critique of how language can hide and gloss over, fascist and threatening things, especially military aspects of it. It's a reminder of like how we also react to language. In English, and I'll get to the Spanish part of it, but in English, there's a more guttural reaction to more Anglo-Saxon words, more Saxon words than the Latinized words. They're shorter, they have more of a kick to them. And so one of my frustrations right now is when our movement stuff doesn't have the language back up to it. I am a big believer in DEI. It goes back to, as I said, my time at UT and activism was to make sure that this university is reflective of the state that it is chartered to serve. But if you go back through diversity, equity, and inclusion, they're all Latinized words. And they start to like hide what it really is about, and it doesn't necessarily have a direct value to it. And it becomes a small group of people that like repeat certain language parts of it. And right now we're in a period where everything DEI gets hit with, a critique of one word of woke. But not enough people can then, they feel what it is that their connection is to diversity, equity, inclusion. But as far as language goes, it's not defending itself. So part of it is you have to get beyond the superficial way that we can talk about things, get into what are the values behind it. It sounds cliche-ish, like in acting, is like, what is your motivation? Why should someone care? And get to that kernel of it. So a lot of it is like the peeling of the onion, the removing the layers, and getting into something basic. I've been in political stuff on my own company 30 years. You can add more years on the experience beforehand. But the one thing that's been constant has really been a declining faith in institutions, a declining faith in Congress or trust in Congress. It used to be polling would check like someone's reelect number and you'd won in the 60s and then they say 50s and now like 40s is the new 50s. You just don't have, people trusting those systems, and those bonds have disappeared, or eroded rather. So language is the tool that I know that we can start to rebuild that, but we have to be pretty intentional about it. We have to kind of remove the laziness of repetition that allows us to hide and not tell people what it is we really care about or what it is we're fighting for.
You encouraged Linda Chavez Thompson to run for lieutenant governor. What was the reasoning behind that?
The correct thing would be when she chose to run, we were there to back her up. And she ran in 2010. But first, Linda was, I believe, executive vice president of AFL-CIO nationwide. And this is just a girl that grew up in the outskirts of Lubbock, cotton picking and doing ag work, and then had opportunities to kind of build and get in the labor movement, and always stood up for workers' rights. I mean, she is a spitfire. She's just nonstop, and she's this short, but she'll take on any giant that's not standing up for workers. So for me, it was an honor really to kind of help her out on that. What she was doing, to be honest, was helping out the Democratic Party when it was in its rebuilding years and filling out positions on the slate, on the ticket. And so she went to go at the behest of labor, probably looking to find people to run for office. The one candidate that was funded at that time was Bill White, who had been mayor of Houston, was running for governor. And LCT was up for taking on the challenge of running for lieutenant governor. And man, she hit up all the unions nationwide. She raised, decent money to have her own operation. She was a real connector, both for a lot of activists and a lot of, marginal voters. 2010 was still a hard year for Democrats, and especially in Texas. But that was a lot of fun to be on her campaign, 100%. So we had, all right, I owe you guys some things, but we'll pull up the bumper stickers where she didn't embrace it at first, but it's just "Que linda" was the slogan we went with her.
Are there any takeaways that you've learned over the course of your career?
Just went to a really beautiful memorial service for Cecile Richards. So this is Governor Richards' daughter, who also started her career as a labor organizer. Then it was just nonstop. She worked in Nancy Pelosi's office. She eventually headed Planned Parenthood Federation of America for like 11 years. Started I think the Supermajority PAC, as far as a different way of making things more cross-sectional with African American and Latino and Anglo women still on women's rights. And they made it not just a sad event, but they made it an organizing opportunity. And it was just a reminder to us that her statement was, not every victory is permanent, not every loss is permanent. So you can't get too settled in the way things are and think that things are going to cruise on autopilot. And you can't quit when things move backwards and not in your direction.
What were some of your accomplishments and highlights that you're especially proud of?
I'd go, I think we've seen a huge evolution and understanding about how to communicate and engage with Hispanics. And part of that education is really reminding people so it doesn't become stereotypical or they don't look at it, with misinformation. And it's, we've known from my UT days, even way back, the research was from the 40s or 50s, that the number one predictor of one's likelihood of voting is age. Over the people I got to meet would be, one was Steve Murdoch, was a Rice professor, but he was the Texas Census Director and then was the U.S. Census Director and worked on a board together. And just looking at the demographics of how young Hispanics are. So there's nothing innate about being Hispanic that means you don't vote. But if overall you see this age gap between the median Anglos and the median age for Hispanics is huge, you're going to have a voting gap too. From that same research, the second predictor of one's likelihood of voting is going to be education. And then education and income are kind of intertwined. The higher education you have, the more likely you're going to have opportunities for additional income. And it goes back that, young, but the demographics is we're not all third generation. The majority, I'm now the minority, the majority of the Hispanic population is second generation. So they are the children of immigrants. And the majority of those immigrants are going to be of Mexican descent, Central American descent, and increasingly South American. Many who've all frankly have come out of economic need or economic aspirations, safety needs, but even that safety need for the most part is tied with an economic need. And so those first generation immigrants didn't come with college degrees. If you look at the whole different nature of Cuban politics in Miami, it was really driven by a misplaced middle class who always thought they were going back. The Southwest has really been shaped, yes, by families who've been here since, the 1600s, 1500s and on. But then the waves of it keep changing it with people that aren't those original settlers. And right now, it is second generation. that are surpassing their parents' educational levels, but because of youth and income of where that goes, you're still looking at low education. And so what does it take to engage people who are younger with less education, and how they seek information and get information is not the same. And then it's, helping people understand it's not just cliches or slogans or a Latinos for. You have to kind of get into the community and how you still build those connections. There are still people that think that, that Spanish is just flowery, and it's Cervantil, and it's longer and more eloquent and more poetic. If you look at the humor, if you look at the rancheras, if you look at it's still more guttural. There's still so much more in common with English, and how English can connect. It's going to be a common emotion and a real connection than it is about flowery Spanish. I think the difference is when you connect with Hispanics would go back to what you asked me about, the shaping of trips to Brownsville and Del Rio and to, border, is more than Anglos. I think you think in a multi-generational context. You have that sense of the sacrifices your parents or your grandparents made. You have the sense of kind of connectedness. And I think religion plays a little bit role here too. It's not so much that it is, the Pope on the wall next to the JFK thing was an old cliche about, family, like Kennedy going through the West Side. You'd see those things, the West Side of San Antonio. It is cultural Catholicism more than anything else, which means it's called a mass. You kneel, you're part of this, your identity becomes part of a larger group in your connectedness, that you're the nephew of so-and-so or you're the godson of so-and-so. It's not, the WASP individualism, ethic of how you're pulling your own bootstraps on your own. It's still very much a worth ethic to it, but there's still cultural aspects to it that make it a little bit more unique, a little bit more ways that you can kind of connect with people's experiences. And so, I think the question was, what do we take pride in the things that we've done? I would say number one is it's just educating people. It's not a mystery. You have to know where people come from. You have to listen to it. You have to see how they fit in and understand what their aspirations are. And then you get it. And then you have to remove the stereotypes about, are they non-voters? Why aren't they voting in their interests? And you have to, where that data is lost, or whether they didn't pay attention to it or didn't do the data to understand that community. And then showing ways that we can connect. I'd say the Javier Gonzalez in San Antonio to get an Hispanic mayor in a Hispanic town doesn't sound dramatic, but it was for Santa Fe, and it also kind of built a bridge. I'd say getting Leo Montalvo as mayor of McAllen, and we defeated Othel Brand, who'd been in office for over 20 years. And I think it'd be easily documented that he was a bigot. He, ran his produce companies, and it was all about business, and was very dismissive of, Hispanic concerns, even though it's an Hispanic town, but where the power structure is different. Helping shift that power structure. I'd say in those open races, Ruben Hinojosa was on the State Board of Education and elevating that education race. Ciro Rodriguez didn't come from a political family, although his family has a little bit of a machine now. But he was a social worker and a different kind of voice. Charlie Gonzalez could take his dad's reputation and then still make it broader and build bridges. So I think we bring an education part of it. I think we're bringing in broader voices we take pride in. And then I think reminding people that it can still be fun and should be. Because we're shaped by the people we meet. We're shaped by the causes we fight for. And it grows with joy.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Aldrete. Is there anything else that you would like to add that I didn't ask about?
First of all, I just want to appreciate the opportunity here. please know I'm a big fan of Voces, and I got a chance to like tell a few stories about some of the unsung heroes and what it really takes to kind of get a movement going. But I don't have any additional things to add. But you gave me my homework, so I will come back to you guys with history on the Salvatierra case, but also those brave mom and dads that helped integrate Del Rio schools and across West Texas.
Okay, thank you.